Hey students, today we're going to talk about variables. These are parts of an experiment that a scientist needs to identify before they can start collecting data. Before we go over the different types of variables, we're going to review the scientific method. So remember that before a scientist can do an experiment, they need to identify a question or a problem so that they know what their experiment is going to be about. And then they usually make a hypothesis. Remember, a hypothesis is a prediction about what the results of the experiment are going to be. It's what the scientist thinks is going to happen or what their data is going to show. Once they have a hypothesis, they can develop a procedure. Remember that a procedure is a series of steps that explain how they're going to collect their data. After the procedure has been developed, the procedure can be carried out, and while someone is carrying out their procedure, they're collecting data. Remember, this is the information that the scientist is collecting. And then they can analyze their data, so that means they're going to figure out what their data means, because that's what analysis is. And then at the end of the experiment, they're going to draw some conclusions. So this is where they're going to determine whether or not their hypothesis was correct and what they learned from their experiment. Another word we're going to review is theory. Remember that if a hypothesis has been proven many times, then it can become a scientific theory. So if many experiments have proven a hypothesis many times over, then a theory. Theories are well proven, and so they don't change very often. So when someone in a non-scientific setting says they've developed a theory, they might not actually mean the word theory. Sometimes people use hypothesis and theory interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. A theory is very well established, and a hypothesis is less well established and is going to be tested. Before a scientist develops their procedure in an experiment, typically they're also going to identify their variables. There are three major types of variables. The first one is the independent variable, the second is the dependent variable, and the third is the controlled variable. And we'll talk about each one of these in depth in the upcoming slides. The independent variable is the variable that is changed by the scientist. So anytime a scientist changes the conditions that something is experiencing, that's an independent variable. There is only one in an experiment. That's important. If you have more than one independent variable, you are not able to determine what is causing your results to change if you get different results. So having only one independent variable is a very important part of experimental design. The next variable is the dependent variable. So the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. If the independent variable is changed, then the dependent variable will change. So it's the than portion of an if-then reaction. Another way to think about the dependent variable is to think of it as what you measure in an experiment. The last variable is the controlled variable or control variable. Sometimes it's called that. It needs to be constant throughout the entire experiment. So the control variable, it can actually be multiple things. In an experiment, there's often more than one controlled variable, and those variables can be, like if you had an experiment about plants, perhaps all of the plants get the same amount of water, they all get the same amount of light, and so anything that stays the same between your experimental groups is part of this controlled variable category. So to summarize, the independent variable is what you change, the dependent variable is what you measure, and the control variable is what needs to stay the same. So those three different things are something you can identify in every experiment. Next, we'll go through some examples of experiments that we have identified the variables in. So in this experiment, the question says, how much water flows through a faucet? The independent variable, if you recall, is what you change in an experiment. So in a faucet, you have some choices, right? You can have the faucet closed, you could have it halfway open, you could have it fully open on full blast, but those are things you can change in an experiment. The dependent variable in this experiment is what you are going to measure. So if your question is about how much water flows through a faucet, the thing you can measure is the amount of water that is coming out of the faucet. And in water flow, that's typically measured in like liters per minute. So you can catch the water and figure out how much comes out in a certain amount of time. And then the last variable here is the control variable. Remember, here you can have more than one. And remember, in the control, it's what stays the same. So for example, in this experiment, you probably want to be using the same faucet the whole time. And then you also, if you are using the same faucet, it's going to be in the same house or in the same laboratory, which means that the water pressure is going to be the same. And so these are all things that stay the same throughout the experiment. We're going to go through another example. The question says, how fast does a candle burn? So we want to know how long it takes essentially for the candle to get used up, right? So again, the independent variable is what you change. You can decide how long your candle burns. So the thing that you can change is the amount of time that you have the candle lit. The dependent variable is the thing that you measure. And when you measure a candle, you can measure how much the height changes, because as you burn a candle, the wax is burned up, and so the height of the candle can be changed as time passes while it's burning. So the dependent variable is the height, because you're going to measure the height of the candle. And then the control variables are the things that have to stay the same. So if you did this experiment, you'd probably want to measure multiple candles, but you'd want all of them to be the same. So you'd want to have, like 5 candles that are all the same, and that would be one of your control variables. You would also want to do it in the same environment, so perhaps an environment that is not windy, for example. So those are control variables, things that stay the same. All right, we're going to go over one last example. This example says, does fertilizer make a plant grow faster? So fertilizer is something that we put on plants to give them extra nutrients to help them grow. The independent variable, if you remember, the independent variable is what you change. In this case, you can change the amount of fertilizer. You can put 0 fertilizer on some of your plants. You can put a gram of fertilizer on some of your plants. You can put 3 grams on some of your plants. So you're just going to choose the amount of fertilizer for your independent variable, because you can change that. To find out if your fertilizer is making a difference, you're going to check your dependent variable. Remember, that's what you measure. And with a plant, one of the easiest things to measure is how much it has grown. So you can measure the height of the plant, or you can measure the width of the plant, or you can measure both. But those are things that you can measure, so those are the dependent variable. And then the final variable is the controls. Remember, that's what stays the same. And so you need to grow all of your plants perhaps in the same kind of soil. You might want to grow all of the same species of plant, like you wouldn't want to use grass and green beans and an oak tree, right? So the same plant type is important. So those are 3 different examples of experiments where you can identify the variables. Later on this week or next week, we'll have some more practice problems so that you get better at identifying variables.